The jar in my hand is Jif Creamy Peanut Butter, the plastic tub with the yellow lid, off the shelf at Sprouts. Most kitchens in this country have carried this exact jar at some point, mine included. And here is the plain fact most people never check. Past the first 2 words on that label, the third ingredient is not peanuts at all. Skippy sits right beside it on the same shelf. Same story, different oil blend. I am going to read every one of these labels out loud, in order, the way I was taught to read any label, before I ever say a word about what is inside it. I will also tell you which jar earns a place back in my own pantry, but not yet. Not until you have heard why the other 3 lost theirs. We start with the one that barely misses the mark. It gets worse from there. Before I go any further, tell me something in the comments. Which of these jars is the one you actually buy most often? Jif, Skippy, or something else entirely? I want to know what is sitting in your cabinet right now, because I have a feeling most of you are about to go check. Peanut butter is one of those foods nobody thinks to question. It is lunch, it is a spoon in the jar at midnight. It is the one thing almost every household keeps stocked without a second thought. The way flour or salt gets restocked without anyone reading the bag. That is exactly why it matters here. The products people trust most on autopilot are the ones worth the closest read, because nobody stands in the aisles squinting at fine print on something they have bought for 20 years without thinking twice. I did not grow up with a jar like this in the house at all, which meant the first time I did read one closely, as an adult, nothing about it was familiar to me. That distance turned out to be useful. It meant I read the words on the label instead of the memory attached to the jar. Most of you do not have that distance, and I understand why. A jar you have bought since childhood does not feel like something that needs investigating. It feels like furniture. That is precisely the kind of product I have learned to slow down on the most. We start with Peter Pan. I picked this one up expecting the least drama of the 3, and in a way, that held. Peter Pan's label reads roasted peanuts, sugar, then under 2% of hydrogenated vegetable oil, rapeseed and cottonseed, and salt. That is the whole label. 4 categories, nothing hidden in a longer list, nothing dressed up with a flavor name or a health claim on the front to distract you from the back. I turned the jar over, and there it was, right where I expected it. The hydrogenated oil doing exactly the job it was put there to do, keeping the peanut oil from separating on a store shelf for months at a time. The plain conclusion is that Peter Pan is not trying to be anything other than what it is. A peanut butter built for shelf life first, peanuts second. My verdict on Peter Pan: it is the mildest offender on this list. And it still is not peanut butter the way my mother would have called it peanut butter. Plain and unadorned. I do not say that with any anger toward the brand. There is a kind of quiet, unremarkable honesty to a short label like this one, even when it is not the shortest label on the shelf. Do you check the ingredient list before you check the price? Or is price the first thing your eye goes to in that aisle? Keep that answer in mind, because the next jar makes the same choice Peter Pan does, only busier. Now for Skippy. And this is where the tone shifts, because Skippy is not simpler than Peter Pan. It is more crowded. The label lists roasted peanuts, sugar, hydrogenated vegetable oil made from a blend of rapeseed and soybean, and salt. That is a full category of stabilizer work happening before you ever get past the front label's promise of something simple. I remember buying this exact jar for years, stacking it in the cart out of habit, before I ever slowed down enough to understand what that hydrogenated line actually meant sitting there on a shelf. I bought this exact brand for a long stretch of my life before I understood what that word meant on a label. The plain conclusion here is that Skippy is not stopping at peanuts and salt either. It is built the same way Peter Pan is, just with a different pair of oils doing the same stabilizing work behind a name that feels a little more premium on the shelf. My honest verdict on Skippy? Read that again. Hydrogenated vegetable oil. Right there in the list, plain as anything, doing a job that has nothing to do with the peanut itself. That is not an accusation. That is just what the label says when you read it slowly instead of skimming past it. Do you read a label front to back, the way I just did? Or do your eyes stop at the first line and trust the rest of the jar to behave? But here is where it gets worse, because the next jar is the one most of you actually have at home. Now we get to Jif, and I want to be fair about something first. Jif is not doing anything Peter Pan and Skippy are not also doing. But Jif carries a weight the other two do not, because Jif is the single most recognized name in this entire category. The jar most people picture the second you say the words peanut butter out loud. Read the label in order. Roasted peanuts, sugar, and then, third on the list, ahead of the salt, ahead of anything else, hydrogenated vegetable oil, a blend of cottonseed and rapeseed. Third ingredient. That is the exact detail I flagged for you at the very start of this video. And here it is again, sitting in the precise place I told you it would be. I paused on that line longer than I meant to. I used to picture peanut butter as one ingredient, full stop, because that is how it was talked about at every table I ever sat at growing up. Peanuts. That is it. That is still how most people picture this entire category, and it matches almost exactly what I found reading these three jars side by side today. Peanuts. That is it, is the assumption most shoppers walk in with. It is not what the label shows, not on the single best-selling jar in the entire country. My honest verdict on Jif? This is not a company hiding anything. The ingredient is printed right there in plain type, in a font small enough that most people have simply never looked. But a jar this familiar, held this close by this many households for this many decades, deserves better than being listed third on its own label, behind sugar and an oil that has nothing to do with a peanut. That is not peanut butter. That is what was left when the plain, one-ingredient version of peanut butter was gone. You would think the pricier jar on that shelf is automatically the better-built one. It is not. Not always. I have seen cheaper store brands with a shorter, cleaner label than a name brand jar sitting right next to it at nearly double the cost. Price tells you what a company believes the name on the front is worth. It does not tell you what is actually sitting inside the jar. That is a habit worth carrying into every aisle you walk down after this video, not just the peanut butter one. Do you assume a higher price means a shorter ingredient list? Or have you never actually tested that assumption against the label itself? This is the point where I ask you to do one thing for me before you keep watching, and it has nothing to do with any of the three jars I just read. Go find me in whatever way keeps you coming back to this kitchen table, because the next part of what I found today surprised even me, and I want you here for it before I say another word. I do need to be honest about the limits of everything I just told you. What sits on a shelf at your Sprouts, your Kroger, your regional grocer is not guaranteed to match exactly what I read off this jar today. Formulas get adjusted, regional distribution varies, and a company can change a recipe without changing a single word on the front of the package. My own mother used to say a label was only true the day you read it, and I have found that to be truer with every year I have spent doing this. Formulas move a little every year, quietly, and most shoppers never notice because the front of the jar never changes, even when the back does. So do not take my word as the last word here. Turn over your own jar. Read your own third ingredient. That habit will serve you longer than any list I hand you today ever could. Here is where it gets better. Because after 3 jars that all lean on the same stabilizing oil in one blend or another, the next 3 show you it is entirely possible to skip that step altogether and still put something on a shelf people will buy. Trader Joe's creamy salted peanut butter is the first one, and this is the jar that surprised me the most out of everything on the table today. I expected some kind of trade-off for a jar this affordable, and there simply was not one. The label lists exactly 2 things: dry roasted peanuts and salt. That is the whole label, start to finish. No hydrogenated oil, no sugar, nothing hiding behind a percentage sign in smaller type. The plain conclusion is that this jar does the one thing the first 3 do not. It lets the peanut oil behave the way peanut oil actually behaves, which means you stir it back together yourself before you spread it. My honest verdict? That is not a flaw. That is simply what real peanut butter does when nothing has been added to stop it from doing what it naturally does. If you want the front of a jar to match the back of a jar, this is where I would send you first. Have you ever put a jar back on the shelf specifically because the oil on top put you off, without stopping to ask whether that separation was actually the more honest version of the product? Smucker's Natural is next, and I want to be fair here too, because this one earns its shelf space a little differently than Trader Joe's does. It is easier to find, sold in more stores nationwide, at a price point closer to what most people already expect to pay for a jar of peanut butter. The ingredient list reads peanuts, and then 1% or less of salt. 2 ingredients, same as Trader Joe's, just wearing a more familiar label that most grocery stores already stock without you having to go looking for it. I have handed this exact jar to my own family without a second thought, because there was nothing printed on that label that needed a second thought from me. The plain conclusion is that a national, widely distributed brand can absolutely build this product without ever reaching for a stabilizing oil. Smucker's Natural is proof that the choice made by Jif and Skippy was a choice, and not some requirement of doing business at that scale. My honest verdict? Buy it. Stir it once. Keep it in rotation, without worrying about what is hiding behind the front label. When was the last time you actually compared a natural label against the regular version of the same brand, side by side, instead of assuming they were built the same way underneath? Kirkland Signature Organic Peanut Butter is the third, and this is the one I did not expect to like as much as I now do, given how much store-brand product I have read labels on over the years that turned out to be dressed-up filler wearing a plainer wrapper. The label lists dry-roasted organic peanuts and sea salt. 2 ingredients again, this time with the organic certification printed right there on the jar for anyone who wants to check it themselves before they buy. What earns this jar its place next to the other 2 is the volume it typically comes in and the price per ounce that comes with buying at that volume. You are getting the same 2-ingredient honesty as the smaller jars, at a cost that makes it easy to keep buying it without a second thought. My honest verdict? This is the jar I reach for most often now in my own kitchen, and I do not say that about many products I bring onto this channel.
Read that again.
dry roasted organic peanuts, sea salt, and nothing standing between those two words and the lid. I set all three of these recommended jars side by side on my counter before recording, half expecting one of them to disappoint me the way store brands sometimes do. And none of them did. I learnt to judge food before I learnt to judge anything else, reading labels at a kitchen table long before I understood half of what the words on them actually meant. That part of me never left, and it is the same part that pulled these 6 jars off a shelf today and read every one of them in order before I said a single word about any of them. A short ingredient list is not a marketing trick. It is just fewer places for something to be added that never needed to be there in the first place. A brand does not need to be new, expensive, or unfamiliar to earn a place on your shelf. It just needs a label that holds up when you actually read it, instead of trusting the picture on the front. Tell me in the comments. Go turn over the jar you already have sitting in your own kitchen right now, from anywhere on this list, and tell me exactly what that third ingredient says. I want to know if it matches what I read today, or if your jar is telling a slightly different story than the one I just told you. Remember the third ingredient I told you to watch for at the very start of this video? On Jif, on Skippy, on Peter Pan, it was never peanuts. And it was never just salt. It was an oil doing a job the peanuts alone were never going to do, sitting on a shelf for months at a time. On Trader Joe's, on Smucker's Natural, on Kirkland, there was no third ingredient to watch for at all, because the list simply ended where it should have. That is the difference this entire video comes down to. Jar for jar, word for word. And I did tell you, back at the start, that I would name the jar that earns a place back in my pantry. It is Kirkland Signature Organic, sitting on my counter right now, next to the 2 I will not be buying again. I haven't bought a jar of Jif since I left, and I don't plan to.